So I can tell that you're drawing from a deep well of knowledge here. Um, can you tell me a little bit about how you got there, and maybe even touch a little bit about what you used to do before you got into this whole shooting thing?
Oh, sure. Uh, Before I was a firearm instructor, I had two primary career paths. I was a musician and played a wide variety of instruments and sang and did all kinds of things, largely in the Christian music scene, but also outside of that, did studio work and stuff like that. And I was also a professional Christian, which is what I call it. I was a pastor of Christian churches for uh, 26 years. And that is a uh, that is an interesting background for a firearm instructor. But here's what I've discovered: practice is practice. The discipline of improving at a skill set translates. And I learned to perform at a fairly high level in the music world, and then spent 26 years uh, being a pastor in churches, which means I spent a lot of time dealing with head and heart. And no matter your take on spiritual beliefs and church issues, uh, I invite you just to consider how many years I spent helping people deep dive into their own story, and just look at it from that perspective. So by the time I started teaching firearms, I had well over 10,000 hours of of focused professional level practice put into a different discipline, and well over 10,000 hours of time spent into head and heart. And so when it came time to help people learn to shoot more gooder, I had a well of experience to draw from. And I am not surprised at all, nor should anybody else be, that my teaching didn't look like anybody else's. Because I took really good stuff from mentors that helped me along the way, but then said, hey, here's my perspective on this, and this is really different. We're going to need to talk through your head and your heart. But how I got started in the defensive firearm thing was being very slow to realize my need for a defensive firearm. And I'm not going to go into all the detail. I'll give you the quick overview. But in 2004, 2003, my firstborn son was strapped in the back seat in a car seat of my Subaru Outback, and I drove up to the church building where I was working and began interacting with the man on the sidewalk. And he assaulted me and tried to steal my car with my son inside of it. And I had one pervasive thought, which was my son. And that was all I could think of in that moment. And using size and strength was able to stop that person, and was very fortunate to be able to stop that person because they had a significant advantage. But I left this episode thinking, so far so good. I was able to stop this thing. I was able to protect my son, and so far so good. And so I was a firearm owner, but not a firearm carrier yet, because again, I had this confirmation bias that tilted toward my own success in that one moment, meaning that I would have success in all the moments. And in 2010, I was in Sunnyside, Washington, at a public park. There were a whole bunch of towns that got to, I live in a rural farming area. There were a bunch of towns that get together that do swim meets for kids, elementary and junior high and high school. And you can imagine a sporting event with hundreds of kids and hundreds of parents and lots of movement and chaos and stuff. And this one guy had singled out my son and was throwing a tennis ball back and forth, and was basically leveraging that game to draw my son away from the crowd. And I was able to pick up on that and run and stop this guy. 20, 30 yards away from the edge of the property where he had a van with the side panel door wide open, waiting. And when the Sunnyside Police Department came to the scene, one of the arriving officers held up a cell phone with a mugshot of an individual and said, "What can you tell me about this person?" And I said, "That's the guy. And this is a known child sex predator that they've been looking for a while." And had to go to the police station and file reports and do all that stuff. And they were looking for video surveillance and all the things. And as I drove home, I'll never forget this, Memphis. As a father, I hope you'll hear this. As I'm driving home, I remember thinking, okay, so far so good. And almost this weird relaxed feeling of, man, I'm 2 for 2 so far. And the likelihood of any of these events happening to anybody is low. And this is like getting struck by lightning, and I've been struck by lightning twice. And I had this mentality of so far so good. I've used size and determination and presence to stop these two horrific things. And 3 years later, I'm at the church that I'm a pastor of, and it's 5 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and I get held up at gunpoint. And two guys walk in the building, and the city that I live near is riddled with crime. And for those of you that understand my faith story of being a follower of Jesus, you can appreciate why we put our church in the very center of the very most crime-riddled part of a very crime-riddled city. We did that very intentionally. And tactically, it was a horrible thing. But spiritually, it was actually pretty cool. And relationally, it was fantastic. But we put our church right in the middle of the worst part of one of the worst town in our state. And these two guys walk in, and they're looking for cash, and I don't have any because I don't carry cash. And there's a gun out, and I'm looking at the hollow point end of a 9mm round the hard way through the muzzle, because the muzzle's so short I can make out the hollow point. And right up in my face, they shoved it in my ribs, they pushed me to the ground, kicked me a bunch, assaulted me, got me back up, walked me around the entire church building for what felt like 11 years. It was probably 2 minutes. Found my laptop, my secretary's laptop, tucked them under their arms, ran out the door. And because of the way our front door was set up, I couldn't really see it. I was able to give a description of the dudes and kind of a vague description of the car by the time they peeled off. And so the next day, because of how I described it, the detective shows up from Yakima PD. He asked me a question that set my soul on a different course. And I don't mean I walked away from Jesus or church. I just mean it was one of those moments where I felt like something about me as a person changed. And I think all of us can relate with this in terms of just having a moment that changes us. The Yakima police detective comes to my office and he asks me, he says, "Well, Pastor, do you have any..." Sorry, let me kill notifications. Did you hear that?
No, I didn't hear that.
Okay, cool. And I'll leave it the way it was. Sorry
Okay.
about that. I
No,
will
no worries.
backtrack. I'll backtrack 30 seconds or so. So the Yakima Police Department detective comes to my office and asks me, basically, pastor guy, do you have any spiritual, moral, ethical reasons that you are opposed to carrying a firearm? And I said, no, absolutely not. And he goes, then why aren't you? And I said, well, so far so good. And he said, what if Here's the moment. I can tell you what I was wearing, what he was wearing, what time it was. This is so seared into my soul. Here's what he said. He said, what if you're not carrying that gun to save your life? He said, what if you're carrying that gun to save your wife's husband and your children's father? And whoa. Brother, that did it for me. And so I started carrying a firearm. I won't go into detail how, because it was horrible, because I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, horrible. I had no idea, no clue. And had a suboptimal handgun, didn't know any better, and didn't know what I didn't know, and just I had a passion for protection, but no skill to match my passion. And so I put in the time to acquire some skill, and then started teaching. And as I taught, the only way I knew to teach was to teach from my experience. And so now when I teach classes, I teach that love protects. I teach that we are striving to get better at this defensive handgun thing because of love. And I tell people that I believe that love is our biggest motivator. And love is patient and kind and doesn't envy and doesn't boast. It's not rude. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. Doesn't keep a long list of wrongs done to me. That way I'm not bitter. I believe that love trusts. I believe that love hopes. And I believe that love absolutely protects. And it would be entirely unloving of me if I am with my wife and my children. It would be unloving of me if somebody poses a significant physical threat to their well-being or to our well-being, for me to take my wife and push her in front of me and hand her my gun and say, babe, take care of it. That's not about gender roles or any other thing other than I'm the one with the tools. I'm the one with the training. And it is my responsibility, because I love my wife, Shannon. It's my responsibility to keep her safe. It's my responsibility to keep Levi and Max and Maisie and Charlie, those are my 4 kids, to keep them safe. And this is super important. It's also, even when they're not with me, even as I'm driving to and from training classes, it's also important for me to keep Shannon's husband safe, and Levi's dad, and Max's dad, and Maisie's dad, and Charlie's dad safe. And so that is kind of my motivation. And that's really what I'm getting at in everything I do. And my teaching methodology is based on my own experience, just like everybody else's. And I'm trying to help people become better shooters. And I'm trying to help them focus on being good people at the same time. So that's what Red Hawk Firearm Training is all about.